Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Kevin Block, Chief Technology Officer, Australia and New Zealand.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. And first of all, thank you all for attending Cisco Live. And thank you all for the digital audience as well. So I've been doing this for a few years. And why I do this is very simple. Two reasons. Number one, to set context for our customers, our partners, and our own employees to where are we directing 25,000 engineers that work for Cisco? Why are we pointing them in this direction? Why are we making almost one acquisition every 6 weeks? Why are we heading in a particular direction? So the whole point here is to provide you with a map of today so you can work out either personally or for your organization where you want to head in the next 12 to 24 months. The second reason is to get your feedback. Are we heading in the right direction? Do you agree with it or not? Please, we're all open our ears to hear the reflections that you get from this. Now, before I start, you'll notice that none of my slides have got references on them. And the reason is that if you really want to see the references, there's a URL at the end of the slideshow. There are over 1,000 references that I've been going through since November last year. And it's through those references and books that you're going to see the slides. So eat your heart out at the end of the presentation. I will also be saying that 2 out of my top 10 will be cut because I really want to leave some time for an unbelievable guest that we've got towards the back end of this hour. United Airlines 3411. This was just over a year ago. The plane was parked at O'Hare Airport. It was chockers. It was due to fly to Louisville, Kentucky, and it didn't move. Systems had told it, you've got a full airline, and you know what happens in the US? They start offering you money to free your seat. Well, they did that, and the system kicked in and said, okay, for $300, does anybody want to free their seat? We'll pay you $300. Nobody budged. System went back, came up, did its calculation. Okay, for $800, will anybody offer their seat? Nobody budged. Systems go back to work, and then 3 men enter the plane. The system had told the 3 men that there were 3 passengers on board that they had to physically remove from the plane because nobody had accepted the offer. One of which was Dr. David Dow, a Vietnamese, 69-year-old Vietnamese doctor, US citizen, who refused to budge because he had patients the next day. And they literally grabbed Dr. Dow, pulled him off the plane, broke his nose, broke his chin, broke his teeth, and it was an unmitigated PR disaster for United Airlines. Now, at the time, the CEO of United Airlines was Oscar Munoz. He had a reputation as a good CEO. He had a reputation for being a leader of some very fine assets, an airline, airplanes, people, but that was clearly not good enough. Because as Mike Walsh writes in his book, The Algorithmic Leader, today's leaders and the future leaders are going to have to understand much more than physical assets, much more than just the people side of the business. They're going to have to understand the algorithms and the systems that are driving their business. In the case of United, the system in terms of congestion, in terms of did you go from 300 to 800, the CRM system, who they selected, that was all done by computers. And that PR disaster wasn't a result of humans, it was a result of these algorithms telling humans to act in a particular way. Crazy stuff. And it's pretty clear that as we enter the 4th year of the 4th Industrial Revolution, a phrase coined by Dr. Klaus Schwab in his book 4 years ago, we've really got to rethink how we lead and run future organizations. Schwab talks about the 4th Industrial Revolution being characterized and calibrated by ubiquitous connectivity, ubiquitous compute. And yet, you know, it's interesting, and I'm sure none of these technologies are unfamiliar to anybody in this audience. You read these every single day. But what is happening, in my observation and my reading, is that we are starting to see that maturation of some of these technologies, the one leveraging the other in terms of what I call combinatorial innovation. So it's about IoT and AI and blockchain coming together to do something much more profound and provide what we're seeing as the next phase, connected intelligence. So that brings me to my number one, your app's your brand. So what are those? Are those logos? Are those apps? Are those brands? What are they? I'd suggest to you they're all one and the same. It's all merged. It's all come together. Your app is your brand. And your application loyalty is now very much predicated on that digital representation that you project in your companies today to your customers. And we all know, we use this every day, we're all online. Hey, if I'm booking via Virgin and I've got an 8-second or 3-second response time delay, I'm going to go Qantas. Now, it's happening across every single sector. It's not just one sector, it's every single sector. You take a look at retail. I don't know about you, but I've bought thousands of dollars from Amazon, and I have never seen any Amazon building, ever. Right? I don't even know what they look like. And you're going to see more of that in terms of Woolies and Coles and our everyday shopping. Same as banking. I mean, who goes to a bank unless it's an exception today? We're all familiar with this. Transport New South Wales. This is from the Transport New South Wales website. In the past, when we wanted public transport, we go and look for the bus. No, that's not the smartest way to do it today. Today, Transport New South Wales will tell you, download these apps, and that will help you define the best form of public transport for you at the particular time. And likewise, when you want to buy a car. So a lot of these buying criterion are becoming part of a very, very digital orientation. Now, something's hidden. Oh boy. Okay, somebody's hidden a slide by mistake. I'll have to just work you through it. The punchline behind this is that the application is, I think we all get the importance of the application and the digital image. The question to all of you is, do you know what's going on underneath the application? Do you know, when we write apps today, it's far more complicated than many years ago when, we had these monolithic applications, right? They ran in one computer center. Today, when we write apps, they're in containers, microservices, could be distributed over multiple clusters, private cloud, public cloud, you name it. The question for you, who probably very familiar with the fact that, the application is pretty much your brand today, the question for you is, do you know how well your application's performing and the user experience? And if you know that it's not performing well, do you know what to do about it? And I do apologize, but there's a couple of slides missing here, but the whole intention of those slides is to share with you the fact that what we've been doing in Cisco over the past few years is to start instrumenting the entire stack, so that when you look at the speeds and feeds of your infrastructure, you look at the storage, you look at the network, you look at the application space, we've been building from titration all the way up to the application and buying companies like AppD to provide you visibility and provide you with telemetry for that full stack. Why? Because it's too complicated for humans to cope with nowadays. So we need to provide you with that instrumentation and that telemetry so you've got visibility into those applications. Again, my apologies. So, number two, from mobile first to AI first. Now, 4 years ago, I put the slide up. And it's a quote from Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce.com. And at the time, the rage was, how do we connect to our customers? How do we connect to their mobile phones? These new smartphones, iPhones and whatever. And you can see what he says here. The real question is whether your company is connected to them. And I would suggest to you we've really moved a lot further now. We're connected. Get that. In fact, there's over 30 billion people just in Australia who are connected, and we only have 25 billion people, right? So we're connected. The question is, what are you doing about the connection? What's at either end of the connection? And this isn't just about, our industry. This has got profound significance from a country point of view. You take a look at Russia. From Putin's point of view, whoever leads in AI would rule the world. This is the former head of Google China. AI is going to change everything. A couple of weeks ago, President Trump issued an executive order to elevate the importance of AI in America. In fact, if you looked at venture capital around the world, there is more venture capital going into AI today than in any other form of investment. And when we look inside our own little industry, right, you can see the numbers from just Google, from Amazon. 250% increase in the number of developers on ML, machine learning. 2 or 3 years ago, I gave this example of AlphaGo. Now, AlphaGo is a game developed by DeepMind, which is a company owned by Google. And at the time, it was pretty profound because it was a computer code that beat the world Go champion, which was an unbelievable feat. This is going back 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, so AlphaGo beat the world Go champion Lee Sokol in a number of games. Last year, I talked about the fact that what DeepMind had done is that they'd retrained AlphaGo to play chess. So now it wasn't just single-skilled, it was multi-skilled, which we take for granted as humans, right? So we moved from one skill to another. But here's the real essence of last year was they got AlphaZero to play itself. And using techniques like Monte Carlo and deep learning, it was able to learn within 4 hours by playing itself. And within 4 hours was able to beat Stockfish 8, which at the time was the world computer chess champion, within 4 hours. So that's where we were. Where are we today? Here's somebody just like one of you and me, Giancarlo Pascudo, a programmer who's also a games enthusiast. He'd been looking at this area, and he's pretty familiar with some of the AI techniques like Monte Carlo, neural networks, reinforcement learning, ML. But he didn't have 5,000 TPUs, TensorFlow processing unit, that Google has to drive DeepMind, to drive AlphaZero. So what did he do? He wrote some code and he open sourced it. And what did he get out of that? 2 things. Number 1, he used the collective intelligence of the community to build a profound piece of code, number 1. And number 2, he leveraged their machines to run it. And so what we're seeing now is an inflection point where through open source, through community, we're not talking about this guy being a PhD postdoc, in some lab. We're not talking about, Google with lots of money building TPUs. We're talking about a community of people just like you and I having real access to AI. In other words, we're talking about the real democratization of AI as we move forward. And there's a real inflection point as we start to spread that through the community. Unfortunately, despite what you hear in the press about AI, you can see here from McKinsey that business adoption is pretty poor in terms of adoption, 12%. Ginny Rometty is the CEO of IBM. She's probably the CEO that's invested in AI before most people. Some would argue probably a bit ahead of her time. But she comes up with 3 key mistakes that people have been making and observations that people have been making about AI. The first one, she says, is it's not really about AI, it's about IA, information architecture. You've got to get the right architecture before you get the right data so that you can train your AI to do the stuff that it needs to do. So that's number 1. And now listen in to number 2 and a touch on number 3.
I saw that. I think you and I talked about that. We learned that early on with doctors. If you try to give them a tool and say, no, you keep doing everything you're doing, add this to what you're doing. They're like, do you realize I see a patient 8 minutes, okay? And this is not going to be able to be added here. So when we rethink how they do their work, that's the second thing people had to get onto, was rethink how they did their work. The third thing is you got to be able to explain the AI, and it can't be a black box. Bias. So number 2,
You can't just bolt it on to your existing process. You've got to actually transform and rethink the process if you're going to leverage AI. And number 3, she talks about a black box. You've got to be able to explain what's inside that black box, whether it's from a regulatory point of view or other, and we'll touch on that later on. And bias is a big deal. I'll touch on that as well. So number 3, infrastructure as code. What do I mean by that? Well, you can see a mobile phone. This is out there today in Finland. And this application basically provides the user the ability to have access to any form of transport, not just Uber, private transport, public transport through the app. Just like number 1 that I talked about earlier. Pretty cool. And the aim of this company, which is called Mass Global, our aim is to provide people with an alternative to owning a car. I don't know if you know this, but the motor vehicle industry is in massive decline because of what's going on here. Massive decline, right? Infrastructure as code. It came from our business, from our industry. Software-defined networking. What do I mean by that? Well, if you took a router many years ago, or even today in some cases, right, what we did was we realized that there's intelligence in that box and there's a control plane in that box. What if we pull the intelligence out but left the control plane there? You have to leave the control plane there. You still need the physical transport, right? And that's what we did. We pulled the intelligence out and we put it in a software, into what we call a control point. And the beauty of doing that was we could now provide control of that physical infrastructure from a single place. That provides a huge number of benefits, not the least of which is the data that we can use. And that data enables us to do 3 things. Number 1, it enables us as humans to be augmented by machines. So the machines can help us do our jobs in terms of running that physical infrastructure. Number 2, it helps us automate. In other words, a lot of the tasks that we as humans have, we can just delegate and shove off to those machines. And even some of those tasks that you think you can do, they can actually do a hell of a lot better. And then finally, using more and more data, we can start just using basic stats and correlation theory, start predicting stuff that we wouldn't have known in the past. And that's why we're talking about a very, very big shift to infrastructure as code. Now, this isn't just happening, in switches and routers and on the shop floor. We're seeing it in oil plants, oil and gas plants, in manufacturing, in transportation, in Tesla vehicles. In fact, and this is a classic case, Rakuten is a Japanese ISP, 100 million customers, e-commerce ISP. And we've just announced a partnership with them whereby they are literally decoupling the hardware from the software of a 4G to 5G network, where the only physical instantation of that network will be the radio. Everything else will be in the cloud. It'll be completely cloud native and cloud based. And that's starting to happen now, right now. And just think, if you're a telco, anybody in the telco audience today, think about how disruptive that is to your entire industry. It is massively disruptive. And as Einstein said in this quote, intuition is nothing but the outcome of earlier intellectual experience. He's talking about you and I, humans. But where we're moving to in infrastructure is exactly that, where we're sensing, based on AI, machine learning and knowledge. The more we learn, the more we train, the smarter we get, the more intuitive we can get, the smarter we know what to do with it. This is the essence of the network intuitive, or intuitive-based networking, whichever way you want to look at it. And it's really moving humans to the side for many of the tasks and enabling this closed-loop world where machines can do things that you and I can no longer do. True story, 7 years ago, I was sitting down having lunch with 4 CIO CTOs. And it was quite a bubbly lunch, lovely lunch. 20 minutes in, I've noticed Peter on the corner is not really saying much. Pete, what do you think about what you're hearing? Come on, what do you think? And he said, you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you, Kevin. I said, no, we're all adults, love to hear your feedback. And he said, well, there's 256,000 people in my organization across 100 countries. And he said, this is our plan, this is our strategy. Now remember, this is 7 years ago. This is our strategy. Everyone is going to have wireless access, no other option. We are not going to buy any more lease lines or MPLS networks. We are going to use the internet. And we're not going to buy any more data centers. We're going cloud. This was 7 years ago. Can you imagine how I felt? I work for Cisco, right? This is our core bread and butter. And he just said, I don't want it. I don't want that anymore. Truth is, we haven't been sitting waiting for this for 7 years. In fact, we've been working on it for a lot longer. The truth is that I speak to many customers who've got exactly this today. And I'm sure many of you in the audience. If you look in terms of inside a company, what are they after? They've got a data center. They want access to public cloud. They want access to software as a service. And they want direct internet access, right? And they want that to be secure at the edge. We can do that. You can see it down the road. Software-defined wide area networking is here and now. And it's here and now because of all the things we've just been talking about in terms of infrastructure as code, and I'll come back to it. We've also announced software-defined access in the last few years. So we've brought it all together, and what you can start to see now is the ability through a control point to set policy across your entire infrastructure in a way that CTO was talking about 7 years ago. We can do that today. And in fact, we see this already cutting in. We see, in terms of SD-WAN, a compound annual growth of 37% for the next 5 years. IDC is saying 70% of our enterprise customers will be on SD-WAN within 3 years. That's why I'm saying this year is the year of SD-WAN. Now, when we start talking about new technologies, and people like me get up and tell you all the blue sky about it, there's also the darker side, which we also need to be aware of. And I bring this up every single year. The last few years I've been talking about how, if we go down this path, how many jobs are going to be wiped out? Well, actually, I think many jobs are going to be wiped out, but there's going to be more work generated than we can ever imagine. Tasks will go. Jobs will change. And the quote that I think summarizes where we're heading, because we've matured our thinking, is this. It's not that machines are going to replace chemists. It's that chemists who use machines will replace those that don't. So those of us who want to stick our head in the sand and pretend that the technology is not doing what it's going to do, it's inexorable, you're going to go the way of the chemist, right? Those of us who understand how we can really harness, help, augment what we do as humans are going to thrive. And it's as simple as that. I'll talk about risk and cyber in a moment. Trust, I think Jenny talked about it. Algorithmic accountability. This has got regulatory implications. It's got a whole bunch of implications that we really as a society need to think through. And last year I talked about attentive cognition and the damage that, say, mobile phones are having. But I really want to roll the clock forward to today. And where's this economic dislocation today? And it really centers around this one word, trust. Because what we're seeing as a society, and I'm not just talking about in Australia, I'm talking about the whole world, is a polarization of power across these logos. And there are less than a dozen, less than 10 in the East and in the West. And everyone, every government, every organization, I think everyone should be quite concerned about this shift in power to some of these logos and some of these brands. Now, they're not sitting still. They realize that, things will change for them if they don't change themselves. So there's a whole sort of discussion now on self-regulation, and hopefully, that'll kick in a lot faster than it has, because the spotlight on this guy has been literally profound. The other is cyber. Last year, GDPR in Europe was announced in May. We had data notification breach regulation kick in Australia in February. We've had 800 data notification breaches since February of last year. So it's a really big deal. And, if you don't listen to what is going on here, you can go to jail if you run a company of more than $3 million turnover. So please take note. Doesn't stop there. I mean, last year we were talking a lot about ransomware. This year, a far more profound problem has been cryptojacking. This is where applications take over your machine to mine cryptocurrency. It's very much more lucrative to leverage your machine to do that than was the case with ransomware. So I think it was only 2 weeks ago that Microsoft found on its marketplace 8 applications that had cryptojacking inside them. So a big issue. Data and bias. And Ginny talked about this. I want to share with you a little story. In my readings, I've been reading, would you believe, from a couple of psychologists, 2 psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and another one, Amos Tversky. They're Israeli psychologists. One's passed away. Kahneman won the economics, listen to this, a psychologist won the economics Nobel Prize in 2002. And the interesting thing about the work that they've done was on what's now turned into behavioral economics. Essentially, what's the psychology behind buying and selling? Okay, that's the work that they did. And they've published lots of papers and lots of books. And this is one example that I thought would be pretty useful, because we talk about bias and we kind of get into gender and stuff, and that's the obvious stuff. I want to share with you something a little bit more subtle. So they did this experiment on 2 groups of school kids. And they said to the one group, do the multiplication of 8 times 7 times 6, etc. And to the other group, they said, do the multiplication of 1 times 2 times 3, right? But they didn't give them enough time to kind of go and do it. They just had to guess it as quickly as they could. And this was the numbers that they got. Now, you do appreciate both multipliers are the same, right? The answer's the same, right? Okay, but notice the median. The median on the top was much bigger than the median on the bottom. Why? Because the first started with a big number. My point that I'm trying to make here is there was inherent bias in the way in which the numbers were put forward to the 2 different cohorts. As subtle as that sounds, that's the sort of thing that we need to start thinking about. Because what Kahneman was talking about at the time was economics. But I'd put to you, as we start to train AI to do stuff that humans are doing, I would suggest that their psychology is now becoming equally applicable to AI. And finally, government and regulation. From a domestic perspective, we've got countries like France now imposing or planning to impose a 3% tax. We've got the ACCC, who've written a 400-page document on what they want to do with Google and Facebook, right? And of course, we've got the United Nations and Cisco talking about what do we need to do in terms of privacy for every citizen on Earth. So these are the kinds of things that are, we need to think about. Expanding to cloud, number 5. Now, in this audience, I don't think I need to talk about how important and how the structural impact that cloud has had on our industry. I mean, if you take a look at Cisco's numbers, we reckon that on average our enterprise customers have got 730 different cloud services. So it's starting to have a big change. But then, if you take a look at the industry, it's a $200 billion industry. Okay, Gartner is saying that this year, 2019, there's going to be more money spent in the United States on cloud than on data center infrastructure. In fact, the money going into cloud and cloud services is going in 6 times faster than data center infrastructure, which is pretty amazing. But it doesn't stop there, because this software as infrastructure, as I talked about earlier, isn't just about the IT industry. It's across every sector. And that's why we see it blossoming to a multi-trillion-dollar sector within the next decade. So that's where that's where we're heading. Now, David Geckler is our EVP of engineering, and he made this statement, and he's absolutely correct. Because there are at the peripheral, you've got people who go straight to cloud. So if you're a startup, you go straight to cloud. Clearly, you're a startup, right? Why would you go and buy infrastructure? We've got some real sort of pioneers at the front of enterprise who go, everything goes to cloud. But the bulk of our customers are not moving to cloud, they're expanding to cloud, because there's a lot of different elements and aspects that one needs to think about. We look at it in terms of these 3 dimensions: applications, and I'll talk about that, management and operations, and where's your data and where's the app going to run, right? And we're seeing, moving from bare metal and what I'd call inexorable shift to cloud native. and going to either microservices and containers or serverless. Serverless still requires a server, but it means that you actually don't have to administer and operate it. It's ephemeral. It's great for like pictures and images and things like that, and they disappear when you don't need it. So there's certain applications that do very well there, but the punchline here is that as an app developer, you write it in cloud native, you don't really care where it's going to run. From a management and security perspective, Gartner's now talking about this thing called AI Ops, and you'll see it out on the shop floor. AI Ops is AI operations, leveraging AI, leveraging machines to do stuff to operate, your entire IT shop. Because we as humans are not going to do as good a job as some of the machines can do today. So that's a pretty big deal, because if you don't do that and if you don't instrument, then you know what? You're going to have your various workloads, and because you don't know what to do with them and they're not instrumented, if you move them, how will you know that you've done any better? Clearly, you won't. So you need to have full transparency, and you need to have that AI operations to make it automatic with policy. Now, the other side is data. Now, a lot of people will have you say, everything's going to public cloud, everything. You might have seen my previous slide. You say, oh, it's all going to public cloud. That's a PC board. There's 100 core on it, multiple terabytes, comes from an autonomous vehicle. It's a mini data center. Think about it. There are going to be millions of autonomous vehicles running around. Not one of those are in Amazon or in Microsoft or in Google, right? We're going to have mini data centers on satellites, in 5G, in central offices, on trains, you name it. We're going to have, in fact, within the next few years, 30–40% of data will never, ever get to the data center, right? And, Cisco coined this cute phrase, there's nothing centered about data anymore. And I think that's a pretty important point, because it's not that all data is going to this public, cloud. In fact, as I just said, much of the data will be anywhere, and we need to deal with that. Number 6, cyber. I've already pointed out this is a major issue. Our CISO believes the bad guys are winning. Why so? Let me give you an example. Robin Denholm, the COO of Telstra, said the other day, I was with her a couple of weeks ago, Telstra gets attacked 3 billion times a day. 3 billion times a day. Think about it. As an attacker, you only got to get through once. Telstra, in the meantime, has got to defend itself 3 billion and one times. So do you, right? So, the scales are really heavily weighted towards the attacker. Cisco reckons there's 120 million new variants of malware in the last 12 months alone. So if you think you've nailed one virus, you got another 19,999. And that was this second. Next second, there's another one. Massive issue. And it's had devastating effects on companies like Marriott. They breached 500 million people's personal identity. 500 million. You're probably one of those. And talk about Maersk, a global shipping organization. They got hit. This is about 18 months ago with NotPetya. When they got hit, it happened so fast that by the time they'd seen it, they didn't have time to shut it down. As a result of that, ships around the world started banking up at ports around the world. Of course, all the trucks started banking up at the ports. The food in the trucks started rotting. Bottom line, $10 billion, one virus. So it's a pretty serious issue. Let's take a look at what's going on here, right? And what can we do about it? This is the sort of situation that was, the traditional model. It was pretty simple. We had lease line networks, multi-protocol layer switching networks of yesteryear. We still sell a lot of them, but they were far easier to defend because the perimeter was pretty simple, right? I think we all know this sort of background. This comes from Verizon. Take a look at the statistics. 95% of breaches now involve stolen credentials. 75% compromised devices. 41% third-party access. And the question then is, where's the perimeter in the modern world where we're all mobile, We're accessing from anywhere and everywhere. We're going to an SD-WAN orientation with direct internet access. Where the hell do we put the peripheral super God box that's going to protect your organization? Well, the answer is, it's not about a box anymore. In fact, as it says on the top right, perimeters are shifting closer to the entities that they protect. This is one of the reasons why we spent over $2 billion buying Duo. It's really protecting you right at the edge, where with Duo, basically organizations are moving to what we call a zero trust or a default deny model. In other words, we don't trust anybody. We want to know who you are, where you are, what device you're using, and what you want to do before we authenticate you into the network. That's a pretty important change in orientation from a security point of view. In terms of hardware, do you know that you're using trustworthy hardware? Very important aspect. In terms of a telco, how do you protect your telco if you can't slice the network? What we're talking about in both cases, whether it's in the telco network or in the enterprise network, we've got to be able to quarantine the network so that if there is a problem, a virus outbreak, and this is particularly interesting and important for utilities right now, where it does hit, you need to be able to shut that down so you don't shut down the entire electricity network, for example. And of course, knowing what's going on in your little domain in New South Wales, Victoria, Australia, not good enough. We need global eyeballs. We need to know what is going on around the world. And that's what Cisco Talos does. We've got literally machines around the world watching for what's coming in. What's coming in. And if we detect an attack in Russia, we can certainly stop that attack infecting countries outside of Russia. And of course, AI ops. Humans can't deal with it anymore. We've got to really relegate a lot of these tasks to AI, to machines, because they can do a lot more than you and I can do as humans. Number 7, 5G and nanosatellites. Now, a lot of you would think, oh, I'm just going to talk about 5G, because if anybody's been reading about Mobile World Congress, it's all about 5G and, oh yes, foldable phones. I'm not going to talk about foldable phones. But I am going to talk about nano, and you'll see why. So let's start with 5G. 5G is not just another G. So as we move from 2 to 3 to 4G, it was more sort of within the telco industry, within the 3GPP standards. It was kind of interesting. This is of national significance. So this comes, quote from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the US. Decisions made today about 5G will affect national security and economic performance for decades to come, which is why America is so profoundly interested in who and how and why they deploy 5G, as is China, as is some countries in Europe, as is Australia. This is of national significance. Whether you agree with it or not is moot. This is what governments believe. But I don't want to get into the geopolitics. I just want to talk about the technology. I want to put some facts on the table, because a lot of people probably don't fully comprehend what we're talking about with 5G. So 5G, first of all, incorporates the 4G spectrum. So that's pretty cool. Below 6 gigahertz, that's cool. We can do whatever you're doing with your phones today, you'll get plus some. But where the real, I guess, sizzle comes from is the fact that 5G incorporates millimeter wave spectrum from 24 gigahertz to 100 gigahertz. And this is where you're getting much higher speeds in terms of bandwidth. In fact, here you can see the difference between 3, 4, and 5G. And the summary of the benefits are here. 10 times an order of magnitude improvement in speed, 20 times in latency, very important, that's the delay across the network. The density. Andy Penn on his panel at Mobile World Congress said, you know, just for congestion reasons alone, it pays Telstra, it behoves Telstra to invest in 5G infrastructure, because it can handle a hell of a lot more than the 4G had in the past. And of course, some sort of cost savings in that respect. And of course, one thing that's not on the slide is power savings. Now, the other thing that's going on behind the scenes is, if you look at 2 to 3 to 4G, it's all been done by the 3GPP standard organization. What's kind of unique now with 5G is that the internet standards, the IEEE, the ITF, are they're all talking to one another. And really the core of what's going on in 5G is now IP. So we're going to see some interesting outcomes from that. Now, that's the theory. Don't believe everything you read in the papers, because I can tell you there's a lot of myths about 5G. Let me start with distance. So for example, when we get into millimeter wave, we're talking about high frequencies. When you're talking about high frequencies, we're talking about short distance. When we talk about short distance, we can't really go through concrete. We can't go through metal, right? What that means is we've got to put more little base stations, microcells, small cells out there, okay? In order to put more small cells out there, we need more fiber. In order to put more fiber, there's more civil works, there's more real estate. There are all these issues that would suggest that this is not a revolution, this is an evolution. It's going to take some time. In fact, it's going to take quite a bit of time, despite what you might hear. So the civil works and the real estate is a big deal. Now, it's not like there are no alternatives. And most of you will be more than happy with your 4G service. In fact, you'll be so happy not to pay another $50 for your handset, because that's what you'll be paying at least for a 5G handset, right? So there are plenty of alternatives. As I said, 4G is not sitting still. There's LTE Advanced. There's Wi-Fi 6. So Wi-Fi 6 is, okay, I'm getting the roll-up. I'm coming now. Wi-Fi 6 is starting to happen this year, .AX, multiple gigabits, and LoRaWAN. We believe the business case is really around the cities, infrastructure, where there's a requirement for much lower latency. I do want to talk about, so do I have time? Okay, so where are we now? Okay, I'm coming. I'll just quickly wrap this up and then we'll move to Chris. There are 3.7 billion people on Earth who have no access to the internet. 90% of the world's surface has no access to the internet. So you might say, well, let's put one of these up in the sky. Problem is, they cost a lot of money. Two things have changed very recently. Number one, the ability to relaunch rockets. And you can see here, case of a relaunch. This is SpaceX. Rocket's been up. This is re-landing. So that's one. And this is the second one, nanos. Nanos operate at about 600K above the Earth's surface. And there's a nano. It's this size. We're talking 2-3 orders of magnitude lower cost. And we're going to see mesh networks of nanos going up there. In fact, at my count, I could, just counting about 5 companies, almost 14,000 nanos about to be launched in the next 24 months. And if you think this is not happening, this is a local company in Adelaide, Fleet. They went out there a few weeks ago and they said, anybody interested in having some access to our satellite for $2 a year? We've got, I think, 1 or 2 million going. Within 7 days, they had application for 3 million. So clearly there's demand. I'm going to skip through this. Sorry about this, because I'm getting the roll-up call. Do apologize. Okay. So there's the top 10. I had to cut through that a little bit. You can see the URL there. And I'm going to, just to let Chris come on the stage, I'm going to play this video. As I talked about, there's a lot of connected intelligence. We don't always get it right. So just to lighten it up a little bit before I introduce Chris.
No meetings today. Remember, tandläkare at 9:30.
Fire off.
Fire off.
Open door.
Door open.
Sånn. Så skal vi sette en til.
Ja. Open door.
Wrong voice command.
Open door.
Wrong voice command.
Open door.
Repeat that.
Open door.
I didn't understand that.
Hey, open door.
Play on the floor.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Turney onto the stage. So there are Chris's credentials, and what we're going to do is just spend a little bit of time in a dialogue. I thought, listening to me for too long would be a bit boring, so I thought, Chris, welcome to the stage.
Oh, thanks very much, Kevin.
Just to sort of set the context, so a mutual contact came to me and said, hey, he knows this really smart guy who knows a lot about, you can see earth science, climate change, and I got to say, I've been an observer, I don't know about you, I read the papers, climate change is a really big deal, but I honestly didn't know much about it. And the idea was we can really help what Chris is trying to do. So I thought, let's bring Chris out here to talk to some of you, and I'm going to take you through that. Firstly, Chris, explain who you are, what you do.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. My name is Chris Turney. I'm a professor of Earth Science at the University of New South Wales. You might have been more familiar with the term geologist in the past, but we sort of move on quite a bit now. We're trying to understand, thank you very much, Kevin, how the planet works. Geology is one part, but we're looking at oceans, weather, climate, biology, bring it all together. It's really interdisciplinary.
Okay, so my first question to Chris was, Chris, is it, you know, we read a lot about the politicians talking about climate change, and now I've got a professor who studies this stuff. I thought, what an opportunity. I'm gonna pocket my pride. I'm gonna say, Chris, is climate change real?
Yeah, you should
Please don't throw tomatoes, but bear with me.
You should never read the newspapers, Kevin.
Yeah, exactly.
Science communication is a big part of what we do, but no, it is real, very much so, sadly, and it's a huge challenge, as I'll show you in some of these slides. But it's also a chance, an opportunity, and we're hearing a lot about this at Cisco this week, about actually reaching out, bridging to people, bridging around the world, taking advantage of these technologies, not just to actually collect data, which we desperately need, but actually communicate better directly to the public.
So Chris, tell us a little bit about what your plans are, because what I really liked about Chris's story is he wants to move from subjectivity and politics to metrics, to measurement, data. I love that, right? What can we measure to give us better information, not just about climate change, but the rate of change of climate change?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So that was kind of how our conversation started.
Yeah. So just to give some context, this is basically it. More carbon in the atmosphere makes the planet warmer. Without carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the world would be about -50 on average, -50 degrees centigrade. You put more carbon in the atmosphere, it gets warmer. Extreme example, Venus. Venus has an extraordinary, 96.5% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and it's got a eye-watering temperature, 462 degrees centigrade. It's hot, all right? And this lovely metric produced by Kevin Pluck on YouTube, you hear the news, depends on what newspaper sources you go to, classic thing, you go to the source you like most. On the left-hand side is over time showing you a rise in carbon dioxide levels through the atmosphere, going back from the 80s. On the right-hand side, annually, going back, showing you the temperature differences over time. And basically, as carbon dioxide is going up, the atmospheric temperature is rising. We only heard last week, this summer is the warmest on record. Absolutely extraordinary. 2 degrees warmer than the average here in Australia. It's a major challenge.
So do you believe now?
It's quite
If you
impressive
haven't,
metric.
don't believe after that, you'll never believe.
And this is the challenge we've got. We're looking at trying to stop the world from warming 2 degrees. And it's not just about, 2 degrees. We're talking about greater climate extremes. Carbon dioxide's acidic. We're looking at increased acidity of the oceans. We're looking at more extremes in climate. We have a timeline. We've got an extraordinary challenge as society, as community. Paris 2015, of which Australia signed up, we have to cut CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 to stop the world warming by 2 degrees. Ideally 1.5. Decarbonise world economy, 50%. That is a hell of a challenge. And the longer we leave it, the more expensive it's going to get and our reduced chance of actually hitting that target. So we're committed. We need to bend that curve. This is carbon dioxide, billions of tons of carbon dioxide. We have to turn that curve in the next couple of years. Some countries are doing it. Just last week, we had 18 countries, long-term decline. But CO2 emissions, despite what you read, are going up. And this is what we want to do. This is just one part that we're trying to do here. The Southern Ocean soaks up billions of tons of carbon dioxide. It's almost like it's a get-out-of-jail card at the moment. It's basically soaking up a huge amount of CO2. It's taking a lot of that carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere. But the problem is, if anyone's done this sailing, it's pretty wild out there. It's a great opportunity to lose some weight. it's dangerous, it's hazardous. The old sailing expression, below 40 degrees, there is no law. Below 50 degrees, there is no God. People don't like going there. It's hard to get data. And this is just animation, just showing you the changes in flux, where the carbon's going. It's either coming out of the ocean or it's going in. The Southern Ocean is this huge reserve, and it changes through time. The challenge we've got, though, is getting that data. And the problem is, it's all based on satellite observations. We're only talking since the late 70s that we've got data. And so working with Titan class and Cisco, we're starting a project that's going out to the Southern Ocean. We're going down to this little place called Campbell Island. It's a few days sailing south from New Zealand. It's one of the most miserable climates on the planet. It rains for 240 days of the year. The rest isn't balmy sunshine like Melbourne normally is. It's just grey, cloudy. People were stuck here. I think they all went mental, sheep farming. I can't have my conscience sending team members down there and leaving them there. We need the technology, and we need data. And the challenge is, or the question is, what's the Southern Ocean going to do? Is it going to keep acting as a sponge? Or is it going to reverse and start kicking out more carbon than it's soaking up? I.e., the conditions are going to be even worse than what we expect in the future. We need data, and we need to go back. So we're using nature. And this is a two-pronged thing working with Cisco and Titan class is we're using the trees that are growing on Campbell Island. It's a World Heritage Area. That's the world's loneliest tree, just up there on the top left. It's a Sitka spruce, a Christmas tree. It's 275 miles from the nearest tree anywhere else on the planet. So it's in the Guinness Book of Records. And that and some of these grey-green shrubs here on the left-hand side, just behind at the top left, are Dracophyllum. They're shrubs. They have year-by-year growth. That is nature's weather records. That pattern of ring growth that we've known since Leonardo da Vinci is a recognition of what the climate is doing. That can punch back through the satellite era. That can go back hundreds of years, telling us what's happening. And the carbon laid down in those trees is telling us what the Southern Ocean is doing. And we want to understand what those changes are happening in the Southern Ocean today. And it's not just about climate. It's also about these extraordinary wildlife. These are biodiversity hotspots. That's for yellow-eyed penguins. They're terribly quiet, and they keep themselves to themselves. They're mostly on these subantarctic islands. There's only 2,000 breeding pairs. They're endangered. The New Zealand sea lions up here, you might know them as hooker sea lions, 10,000 breeding pairs. They are critically endangered. And so long-term, what we're hoping is we'll be able to actually monitor populations in these remote locations. And so this is what we're doing. This is rural Australia. If you want to see some of the examples of this, it's in Innovation Central, just behind me here. And we're taking that technology from rural Australia, and we're going to put it into the subantarctic islands. Later this year, October, we're going down, working with the team, putting something like that with, I dream of that sort of weather, into the Southern Ocean. And this is Campbell Island. Don't be deceived, that little red dot, that is 3 days hard sailing to get down there. And we're going to be putting these sensors on the trees to actually measure the growth of trees, measure the climate, and then also measuring carbon dioxide levels, methane levels, and a whole string of other conditions at the time, and using a LoRaWAN network to actually collect that information and beam it back about every 40 minutes or so. Whereas in the bad old days, and I'm talking until like recently, you either dumped someone down there who you didn't like and left them for a year and a half, and then hopefully came back and removed the bodies, or you had to go down regularly. That's tough. With this technology bridging the Southern Ocean, we can do this. So this is at the moment, this is Northwest Harbour, where you can see the slightly grey area there with the red and the green. Here's the loneliest tree in the world, the planet. It was an area where they did lots of whaling now, but so no one really can go down there. We have to work with the Department of Conservation. But long term, the idea is to actually set up a network where we can hit the whole of the island. And long term, all these subantarctic islands get this critical information that we so desperately need. And I think that's probably...
So let me just explain that. So what's going on here is a sort of partnership between New South Wales University. I think the New Zealand government's involved.
Department of Conservation we're working with, yes.
Titan Class, which is a partner of Cisco, using so there's software and some Cisco hardware that provides a couple of things. It provides the connectivity on the island, and then using LoRaWAN and Wi-Fi if we can, and whatever else technology that works, and then using satellite to bring it back to Australia, to your office.
That's right, and we can collect that information in real time. And the great thing is, it's a beautiful part of the world, and you can tell these amazing stories and engage the public and get them excited about science again, in spite of your newspaper sources.
Cool. Chris, thanks very much. That's a great story, and we're looking forward to really helping the world measure itself a lot better. And thanks very much for your
Thank you very much.
partnership
Thanks,
as well.
Kevin. Thank you.
So that's it. We're at 000. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of Cisco Live. Cheers.